Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of Gans processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the KAKT American Knowledge Team meeting of 2025. And we are at a very important juncture in our evolution because things are changing as we speak. And so the events of the last months have really yielded fabulous results. And one of the reasons that we're all getting here together is to follow in that jet stream that is led by Mr. KAKT on the Knowledge Seekers workshops by the Brazilian community on Fridays. And here we are trying to bring together this knowledge to the various other continents who may have missed that part of the program, and try and deliver what we think is a more of a layman's point of view, although, we really have to take into consideration the new science, and we have to understand the terminology and how it applies to that new science. This is the KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We are still in the intermediate Gans Tech series, and today we're going to discuss Gans of Ganses. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It's November 23rd, 2025, and this is part of the KAKT Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. And as we all know, it's been going on for a long period, and we've been trying to distill this into bite-sized pieces for the new knowledge seekers and also for the mature knowledge seekers. But I think what we all have to understand is that we are going to have the full range of understanding to deal with. There are millions who have never heard of us, and that is actually hard to believe. But on the other hand, understanding the resistance that we've had, kind of accounts for that. But we as knowledge seekers have to understand that there is a basis in science, and once that is disproven, then that has to be discarded. And we are actually now launching a series of the practical application of this. And so we have to extend our knowledge. And so when we talked about way back on the teaching series, we talked about what does it mean to be nanotech and what does it mean to be Gans tech. Well, we've had to elaborate on that because it is shining a different light on the books of Meritevicoli Cash, like in book number 1 of particulars, the universal order of creation of matter. And it's been very hard to describe matter because we are so physical in our acceptance of matter. But that physicality has been restricted by the speed of light. But, the speed of light means that there is a source and there's a destination. And in between the two, we can measure that speed of light and how long it takes to achieve that. And now we can see that that speed of light is very much from an earthbound perspective because we can measure it. And I often wondered what would happen if we took that measurement and took it into outer space. Would that be possible? And according to the equations, we would have to have a pretty big ruler. But when I say ruler, I'm talking about a measuring stick. So in book number 3, of course, we have the origin of the universe, and then we would need a really big measuring stick because we are just concerned with our little tiny universe. We call it man's universe, and as men, we tend to dominate, and yet we find that there's a sister's universe that is actually bigger. And, our universe is only a part with respect to our time and attention. And all we care about is not only our sphere of influence, which is Earth, but more importantly, our sphere of influence, which is our own self-serving personal life on that Earth. And so how do we understand that in the context of the universe? And if that's too big a bite to swallow, then we have to partition it and subdivide it and distill it down into little bite-sized pieces. Well, the thing is that for 405 weeks, Rick Kremen and the Universal Council members have been bringing together the knowledge of the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. So what we all have to really understand is that we are all part of the humanity species, and we are all representatives of this Earth space. And then we wonder, why are we fighting amongst ourselves when we are all part of the same family? And that's actually a notion that is fairly easy to understand because there are many fights within the family members, brother against brother, or sibling rivalry, or even competition between the spouses, and so it involves conflict, and this is the whole nature of on our planet, conflict. And the reason is because we don't understand the plasma rule. And the plasma rule is the direct opposition to the physical rule, where the higher strength eats the weaker strength. But in the plasma rule, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And so that conflict point becomes a transaction zone where instead of a warring between two nations, it becomes a binding zone between two field strengths. And that manifests into an inertia field. And that inertia field is always a lower density, it's a lower field strength field, which means it's an increased density. So we can say that every transaction zone is an inertia density manifestation. But we didn't say, at what level of manifestation. So from our physical point of view, we have a self-serving need to bind energy because that's our dimension point and that's our point of view. And seeing as we're all on one planet, one nation, then everyone on this planet has that same point of view. So where do we get off on lying, cheating, and stealing this energy binding need at the expense of others who have that very same need? And so they are confronted with the notion that they either have to fight back with respect to that stealing of energy, or they have to pass it on. And when we see that the prosperity is to those who lie, cheat, and steal, and what it means to be prosperous on this planet, because particularly in Canada, it's rude to be poor. So if you want to be prosperous, you would do that at all costs. And this leads to the kind of social decay that we have. And we can coexist within this social decay, but you know, it's hard to complain if you're a uh, supplier of illicit goods and you get mugged by someone on the street who needs to generate the money to purchase your goods. It's hard to complain about that because they're just doing their job and it's a matter of survival. So we find that this notion where we need to survive at the expense of others is part of what we call the fallen angel syndrome. And so scientifically, we're falling into what we call angular density, and that increases not only the density but the pressure, and of course it increases gravity. All in all, it increases dependence on the Earth space feeding. So there is a angular momentum that is conserved, which means that the opposite to this increased density as it goes to the core is offset by this internal popcorn pressure of the Gans tensity. And that's what we've been discussing, and is the Gans tech and how it relates. So we understand that at the core is this pressure and this density, but externally is this tensity. And so this is now the question, what is the difference and what is the impact? So for instance, when we look at the solar physicality, it, has this encapsulating field. It encapsulates the physicality. And as such, it puts an invisible shield. But this shield is actually an illusion because in terms of the regular physicality, it's invisible. But a clairvoyant can actually see that. And so what are they seeing? They're seeing the emission of the aura, but it's in color. And that color has a meaning and is attached to the emotion of the individual. So it's very hard to lie to someone who is clairvoyant. And in fact, you can't lie because the clairvoyant is not seeing the physicality and the bluffing. It is seeing the true intention of the soul. And so we see the shielding as an armor. Sometimes we see it as a weapon. Some animals even have it as an exoskeleton. And it becomes part of another form of shielding, such as camouflage or deception or diversion. And then, of course, there's that translucence, which can see beyond the Coulomb barrier. So shielding is like as a catch-all of everything. And so we see craft that are passing through our solar system that are catching all the debris in their shield. And so we don't see the craft. We just see the dirt on the craft. And what is telling us that it is a craft is the anomaly of its trajectory, its performance, its speed, and the fact that the speed is manipulated. So here we are on this planet Earth, and we're so fascinated, and we look at what we call riders on the storm, who are impressing the impressionable. These are fashion dandies in their chariots of fire. And it exposes the confusion that we're all faced with because we're reluctant to question it. And why? Because there is a phenomenal force that is asserting these points of view. And if we question it, and if we question it hard, the answers that are given are inadequate. Because what they do is they facilitate this louche dilemma that we have. And louche harvesting is the harvesting of energy from someone else. That loosh is the energy of your vitality. So each of us has this single-minded intention. And because of the nature of our society, it ends up being a hive mind intention. And so we look at, say, oh, well, your honey is, quite attractive, and I like your honey. It's more attractive than mine, so I'd like to steal it. And then, we use all sorts of means to shield our intention, but the true Gans intention is there. It doesn't change, and it's not invisible, especially to a clairvoyant. And the consequences can be very, very harsh. So what we have to understand about the Gans intention is how it compares versus external intervention. Because the Gans intention is from within, and the intervention is from without. And so how does this affect our adaptability? That becomes a big question, and some of us are able to adapt more than others. But it is a consumption in that process, and it is not actually mitigated when you become a loose leaker. So in other words, it's bad enough. Life is hard enough on this planet without having to adopt a loose leaking protocol, such as pitifulness or addiction, like say alcohol addiction or whatever. And then of course, there are some addictions that are not obvious, such as the addiction to power. And which means that although we are all equal, some are more equal than others. And it's draining. It's draining on our vitality. And it's not just draining on those who are stolen from, but it's also draining on those who are stealing, because they're under the impression that there are no consequences. So that they can get away with all kinds of miscreant behavior. And that is just patently untrue. So we're all subject to this vitality reduction. So we need to charge up. And how we charge up with our emotion and our physicality is what it leads to the golden years when we retire, because we work hard all our life to retire in our golden years. And most of us spend those golden years in the doctor's office waiting to see the doctor, or in the hospital waiting for some kind of external intervention, because we fail to understand that the way we run our life is according to some commandments that were given. And if we look at, number one, I am the Lord your God, well, right off the bat, it's like those tests that you have in school, that say, well, the first thing is to read the full list before you start to answer the questions. Well, in this case, the full list is depending on the first answer, where the Lord is your God. So is that true? Are those two words synonyms? Well, when you bow down to the Lord's, you have to wonder, why is that plural? And then, of course, you have that thou shalt not lie. And does that include everyone? And when you say everyone, doesn't that mean everyone, including the writer of the commandments? Or is it except the writer of the commandments? So thou shalt not lie unless you are the writer of these commandments. So it becomes quite a shock if you are, shall we say, devoted to that kind of thinking. But if you're looking for this truthfulness, and that comes from the Gans, you see, because there's no poker playing outer space, that this is the truth seeker's dilemma. you have an accountability to yourself, but when you run into someone who is lying, do you accuse them and you become party to this conflict, or do you just shield yourself from it? And this is how the universal community is dealing with us. So we have the liar's dilemma, where you have to have an accountability to your soul, and there are always consequences. So do you quit lying, or do you suffer those consequences? And it may not be immediate, it may be delayed, but it is manifest nevertheless. So we need to shield ourselves from this, and this shielding becomes an inertia for our humanity to shield ourselves from these hostiles, from aggression, from environmental harm, and from fear mongering. All in all, it's emotional abuse. So when we're talking about the Gans, we were first introduced to that in the Cups of Life. And one moment, please. Let's remember that the Cups of Life were not the cups of the pandemic, but they showed us how we can create this carbon nanocoating. It's a process of the monatomic science, different from the atomic science. And we created two cups, an emotional cup and a physical cup, and they represented the inner space strength. But they were also representing our emotional strength. So the translation of some of the emotional strength is manifest in the physicality. But not only, we were able to create other ganses such as carbon dioxide, calcium, zinc, copper, amino acid, and water. And these were all part of the radiance manifestation. So let's remember, when you say the radiance manifestation, we created the cup of life, and there was a radiance emanating from that, and it interacted with the components of the cup of life and created this Gans. And so we could do that with all the elements on the periodic table of elements, including gold. And that is the big revelation for the year 2025, because it was representative of what we are dealing with in our brains, where we have the cup of the universe. We have a bicameral mind, and it too is operating with the synchronicity of the copper Gans and the zinc Gans, which represent the physicality interacting with the emotional strength. And then how do we determine what it is? Well, we have to introduce that third field, which is the carbogen. And so now we have these three fields interacting, and what do we get? This gravitational cup of the universe, and how does it have, and what does it have as with respect to its inertia density manifestation? Well, it's called the body, isn't it? It's called the body. So when we're looking at the body in our carbon 12 format, is the transmission highway. And what we want to do is to get to that transmutation highway. And what is that path? Well, there's that intermediate highway, the carbon 14 highway, which is the transition highway. And from the transition highway, well, you still have choices. You can elevate to the transmutation highway, or you can drop down into the physical highway. And let's not forget that these are all connected, because when we look at these cup relationships, we understand that each cup has this magnetical gravitational relationship that facilitates this soul radiation. And so there's an inertia that happens within each cup. But prior to it manifesting in its physicality, there has to be a place. And so we had the Earth cup. And so the interaction of the soul radiance with the Earth cup created the inertia cup. And the inertia cup is the physical manifestation taking into account the relationship between the cup of the soul and the cup of the earth. So each cup has been able to manifest its own Gans. And the earth, of course, it's able to manifest its own Gans. So when we look at the cup of inertia, really and truly, that is the cup of the Gans of the Gans. And that's what we're talking about today. So when we look at this Gans and we say, well, okay, let's remember something is something and nothing is nothing. So something is always something as opposed to being something else. So you have to look at this transaction zone and to see how it's created. So when we look at on the left-hand side, we see from the top down into a cup of life, we see that a rotating field is beginning to be formed within the Gans. And then on the graph on the right, we see the result. And that transaction zone becomes a hole in the Gans. So this Gans is actually gas as a nanosolid. And in that hole is a liquid. So one could say that that is Gans as a nano liquid. So we see that field that is rotating within the graph. So we can see that we have different Ganses there. We have a Gans of the air, we have the Gans in the liquid, and we have a Gans in the solid. And so these are all Ganses in nano state. But when we look at gas, gas is in a gas state. So water vapor is a gas, isn't it? Hydrogen is a gas, oxygen is a gas, but when you bring those two together, it forms a liquid. So wouldn't water be a gas in a liquid state? And then we know that the water can freeze and form ice. So wouldn't that be gas in a solid state? So what is the difference? What is the difference between something that is physical in a different energy state where it can go from a gas to a liquid to a solid, or a Gans, which can go from a nano gas to a nano liquid to a nano solid? What is that difference? And there is a difference. So what we're talking about is the Gans of the Gans, isn't it? That's the whole discussion today on what we're trying to achieve here. So if we look at the cups of life and we say, okay, well, we created a cup of the emotion. But what happens if we create another Gans with another cup of emotion? We have two fields interacting. It creates a transaction zone. We are already in the Gans state. There's no rule that says you have to leave the Gans state. You can stay in that Gans state, or you can drop down to a nano state, or you can elevate to a plasma state. So when we bring these Gans products together, that creates another transaction zone. And so what we're investigating today is if we've already produced a Gans, what happens as a result of making a Gans of the Gans? Well, the results have shown that the Gans field becomes stronger. And we've done that by measuring the field strength, and literally the field expands. You could say that the production of Gans is like a double distillation. And of course, all the whiskeys know that, triple distilled is even better. And so you could literally proceed with making a Gans of the Gans of the Gans. In other words, triple distilled. They call it triple sec. And the dimension of that field extends enormously. And so if we look at the relationship of the expansion of that field, unlike octaves on a musical scale, where you double the frequency, it's 1 octave. But if you create the Gans of the Gans, you're taking the field strength and multiplying it by the other field strength, you start to get an order of magnitude change in field strength. And so if one order of magnitude is 10 and a second order of magnitude is 10, then that field strength would be relatively, say, 100. And then if you were to do that one more time, as in triple sec, you would get 10 times 100, which would be 1,000. So the literal production of Gans of a Gans is enhancing the field strength by orders of magnitude, which follows the understanding of the pH table. Remember the pH table? When you went from a pH of 6 to a pH of 7, that was an order of magnitude. And from 7 to 8, that was an order of magnitude. But 6 to 8 is 2 orders of magnitude. So now we're starting to understand the relationship of all of these things. So when we take these two fields into account, we understand when we nano-coated our copper wire, we created a nano-coating, which wasn't copper, but was carbon. It was a carbon nanocrystal. And then when we applied the field alignment, then we had a relationship between the magnetical outtensity and the gravitational intensity, and it created this inertia point where we had this superconductor, this nano alignment. And so from there, we were able to elevate from the atomic state to the nano state, and via the pico state, which we talked about last week, we could elevate to the Gans state. But these all became part of the Magrav energy transfer states as dictated by the conservation of inertia. So based on the susceptibility, the nanostate could elevate to the Gans state, or the Gans state could diminish to the nanostate and through its increased density. And in fact, it doesn't have to go step by step. We can go directly from the atomic state to the Gans state or vice versa. So all this means is that energy is moving. So if we understand that curves, which is the way we interpret our physical shields, isn't it? But these shields are as a charge. And because of the bending, they create a negative charge all along the surface. So it means it's negative on the outside and positive on the inside. And so the charge itself has nothing to do with the energy as such. It has to do with the energy in motion, because the energy itself is always positive. So the magnetical emission is negative and the gravitational absorption is positive. And so the field strength is determined by the rotation of the field and that speed of rotation. And so there we have a determination of the strength, and it's always different. And furthermore, we can also change the direction because this is based on the polar energy. And so we understand that the poles can flip. So when we look at what we call the Gans freakout, that's really Gans popcorn, where you had a gas as a nanosolid that used to be gas as a nano gas. And this was created in the gas as a nano liquid. So the Gans expanded and it created this magnetical negative charge. And so it was offset by the gravitational positive charge. So the problem with the Gans, of course, is that we can see it. And gas is usually invisible. So there must be gas in the center, but there was a Gans explosion. Because the Gans is clearly visible, whereas the nanocoating, being monatomic, is invisible. And then when you look at going down to a greater density, you look at the pico coating, which is sitting interstitially in the nanocoating. And when you look at the pico coating, it reminds you of the Gans popcorn because it looks the same. But what if we can say that the nanocoating, being monatomic, is circular, spherical, in other words? And since we shrunk it down by 3 orders of magnitude, it kind of crinkled up. It shriveled up. It's almost as if it were dehydrated, right? So it doesn't have that puffy feel to it. It doesn't have that fullness of the nanocoating monatomic structure, but it has more of a wrinkled surface. But this wrinkled surface, because it's a sphere, ends up being points all around that sphere. And so how did this pico popcorn, which is tiny, 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 I mean, 10 to the minus 12th, end up as, which you can't see, you require a special camera to see it. And so, you know, that those big blobs around the pico coating are actually the nano coating, which also you can't see. The only reason we can see it is when you accumulate 40,000 layers. Well, okay, you know, now we can see the blackness, but individually we can't see the nano coating. So it becomes transparent, translucent. So the pico popcorn has a physicality, but you need the special equipment to see it. And then it turns into Gans, which you can see with the naked eye. But the one thing about the Gans is that it comes in different sizes. And then when we look at the earth matter, we have to question, is it transacted in singularity or in duality? Because whatever we're seeing on Earth is inertia, density manifestation, reaction. So we know that because we can create the Ganses of all the elements on the Earth. And they all have different colors. So that means they all have a different selectivity. And this selectivity is determined by its location, isn't it? Because you have to look at the neighbors. So you could have gold in one area and gold in another area, and they have different purities. This is also true of oil, for instance. Not all oil wells are the same. So the chemists know all about this, but, you know, they never really explain it in terms of the nuclear feeding inertia, because each part is a fragment of the complexity, and each part that we see is gravitationally stable. But the fact of the matter is that there's energy being transacted from the adjoining forces. So we have 3 dimensionals, what we call in the universal order of creation of matter, the matter, dark matter, and antimatter coming together and create this one-dimensional point. And so we have these 3 dimensions coming together, creating this transaction zone. But you still have the original matter, dark matter, and antimatter, because energy is always in motion. So that means it's always coming and going. So if you're going to maintain this gravitational stability, you better keep it coming. And we do. We have in the periodic table of physical matter all these different Earth space range details, and we see that, they have a number, and that number relates to the proton, and each proton has a corresponding electron. And what's interesting about these things is that they aren't all on the same energy level. So we are able to manifest an inertia density manifestation that is different and more stable in its physical range. And we have these different details like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, iron, gold, copper, zinc, and, sodium, magnesium, potassium, and calcium, just to name a few. And they are all specific in their detail, and they're all physical. But do we know how they were created? And do we care? Well, if the only tools you have is a pickaxe and blood, sweat, and tears, well, go for it. But what we have to understand is that each field capture in its singularity is a maggrav, and it has a counterweight. That is its angular momentum, angular density. So we have fallen angels, we have arrived angels, and we have flux lines of gravity. So everything is variable, and everything is counterweighted. So the more you get to the extreme is also counterweighted. So the tendency to change actually increases. So you can't just look at the singularity. In other words, when you look at the Gans motion within a cup of life, and you see how the Gans moves up and down in the water, you have to understand that there is an exchange of energy because the Gans can do this. Gans has a counterweight. And so if the Gans is going up, there has to be an energy transaction. And if the Gans is going down, likewise, there has to be an energy transaction. And so this is what facilitates this gradient transition. So if you look at the cup of water as many lines of density, the higher you go, the more magnetical, the lower you go, the more gravitational. And so as you see, their heavier Ganses go to the bottom and the lighter Ganses can move up. But in this motion, we have to understand that they are always giving and taking and exchanging energies. So if you want to leave from one level, you have to drop one. And if you want to move to the next level, you have to pick up one. And this is done simultaneously, and that's how you get the motion. And so the speed of that motion is dependent on the steepness. So that's your transition gradient. Okay, so now we're starting to understand more how this radiance emission is coming through this vertical emission. And it's part of the feeding radiance. And so what we're looking at is this polyatomic gradient transitioning. So we have this magnetical plasma that is coming out of the emission, but it moves. And so at that point, it has to flip its pole and become gravitational. It's still a magnetical plasma with relationship to the gravitational plasma at the core, but it is now a gravitational magnetical plasma with relationship to its original position. So now it has a new position, but at that position then has to change in order for it to keep moving. So once it arrives, then it automatically has to flip. And so it goes from magnetical to gravitational, back to magnetical, back to gravitational. And so that feeding radiance eventually becomes the feedback radiance. And so this flipping is going on all the time. And you never see any tsunamis that are related to this because this is all part of the cosmic ray feeding. So this energy, which is in motion, isn't just fed from the vertical emission, but it is also fed by the external cosmic ray feeding. And in order to counterbalance that, we have to have an internal gravitational feeding. Because when we look at the Earth, it's sitting in a vacuum field. So there has to be a corresponding core vacuum. Because otherwise, there wouldn't be a balance. So if that's true in the physicality, it's also true in the plasma reality. And so this energy is always coming to allow that motion to continue, because energy is always in motion. And if that energy is leaving, then there will be a diminishing of the physical presence. But if it's supplemented by the cosmic ray feeding, then it will always maintain its magnetic relationship. And you know that is true, because look at the sun. It is not a consumer, but it is a catalyst. It is always giving and taking. So in order to understand how this energy is being emitted from the sun, we have to understand that there are multiple transaction zones. So from this orbit that is going around the basic gravitational core is interacting with the core. And so there's a transaction zone as things are moving. And when it moves from one position to another, you have two transaction zones, and that affects the core transaction zone. But then when you're looking at that feeding, it is coming from another source. And so that other source is interacting with the magnetical fields, and that creates a transaction zone. So that motion has a transaction zone from its magnetical position to its gravitational position. But those two transaction zones add up to the motion. And so the movement from one point to another point is also a transaction zone. So we see the similarity that the movement on the magnetical field is an inertia field transaction zone created by two supporting transaction zones. And the inertia field of the gravitational transaction zone is supported by two transaction zones interacting with that magnetical field. So if we understand this concept, then we start to understand what we mean by the Gans of the Gans. Because our bodies are bags of Gans, and within us, within our skin, we have Gans. And that Gans is a transaction zone that is supported, shall we say, basically by two transaction zones. But it becomes very complex when you take into account the trillions of cells that we have. So each is a gravitational binding point. And there are apparent terminal ends because we don't see the connections. We just say, oh, well, those are the loose ends. And all we have is our arbitrary point of view, which is our, this is our physicality. But our physicality is constantly moving. So it has different points of view. That point of view is always dependent on the susceptibility to increase or decrease the magnetical gradient charge versus the susceptibility to increase or decrease the gravitational gradient charge. And so that gravitational inertia point, that is the transaction zone between these two fields, is always subject to its susceptibility. And so there you have your star inertia gradients that are constantly changing, constantly in flux. So when we look at the Gans and the Gans, and we say, okay, well, there's the cup of emotion. We created a cup of life, an emotional cup. But if we interact the product of that cup of life, which is the CO2 Gans, which is the zinc Gans, I'm sorry, which is the emotion, we can create a transaction zone of another Gans. Well, if we take the cup number 2, which is the CO2, and have 2 cups of life interacting, and we take the Gans of the cup of life product, and we have a transaction zone with the cup of physicality. So the product becomes the Gans of the Gans. So let's just go back for a second and discuss orbitals, because we were talking about the electrons and how they work. So when we look at the basic core, the basic atom, and in the atom of each element, it constitutes a proton. And it has an equal number of electrons as a counterweight. But what's interesting about these electrons is that they don't all operate on the same energy field or same energy strength. So we call it an orbital. We say it orbits around the core. It orbits around the proton. And so we have different orbital names. And so let's refer to it as a spherical, principal, diffuse, or fundamental. But these are all different energy strengths. And because they expand, we can have more factors. So in the spherical, being the nearest to the core, is one orbital. And one orbital can have up to 2 electrons in each orbital. The principal one has 3. And likewise, it can have 2 in each one. And then we just keep expanding, and each one's a different energy level. But let's remember, these are all within the atomic energy state. So if we compare the annotation of the basic element on the periodic table of elements is the hydrogen. And the hydrogen is unique, is that it does not have a neutron. It is just an electron and a proton. So it only has 1 electron. And so we designate it as 1s superscript 1. And compare that to carbon, which is carbon 6, and it has 6 neutrons. So it would have 6 electrons. So it has 2 electrons in one spherical orbital, 2 electrons in the second spherical orbital, and 2 electrons in the first principal orbital. And so you see the pattern that is created. And so you see the difference. The point I'm trying to make is this. Hydrogen is not just hydrogen. Hydrogen molecules have a covalent bond. And if the poles are similar, then it becomes orthohydrogen. And if the poles are opposite, then it becomes parahydrogen. The characteristics of parahydrogen is different from the orthohydrogen. So the polarity not only affects the field strength, but it affects the nearness and proximity of these orbitals. And so we get a change. And since there is a change, it actually changes the personality of that particular field interaction. So therefore, if we look at the cup of emotion, and we interact with another cup of emotion. So the zinc Gans, which is the product of the cup of life, creates a transaction zone of Gans of a Gans. And if we compare that to the cup of physicality, which involves the CuO Gans, which is the copper, that also creates a transaction zone. So now you have two Ganses of Ganses. So now we understand the concept of duality. You have 2 points that work as partners. They work in tandem. We call it the twinity. And so you have a transaction zone that is created of the coming together of various field strengths. And you have one field and you have another field, and the combination of these two fields is that transaction zone. And so if you look at the creation, where you have the creation and you have the lowering, what you call the dissolving, the decay, there's a transaction zone there. So when we're looking at the Gans of the neutron and how it creates the Gans of the atom, you also create the Gans of the PMT. And there has to be a counterweight. And the link between those two counterweights is another transaction zone. And if we fail to really understand it, then we just kind of fudge it and just say, well, we're either going to pay attention to it or we're just going to fluff it and ignore it somehow. So you can't ignore, because even in the singularity, there's a susceptibility when two forces come together. So we have to understand that that singularity is the binding zone between these two forces. And then we extend that via the susceptibility and duality, we create a star formation where we see these rotating cups with the Ganses in there, and they create this field, and the interaction of these fields creates another transaction zone. So there's Gans in the rotating cups, but they create another energy field. Because of the nature of it, it will create a higher energy. Will that energy go, let's say, from a solid to a liquid to a gas because it expands? Or will it go from a nano to a Gans to a plasma because it expands? Or will it go from a Gans of a solid to a Gans of a liquid to a Gans of an air in a nano state? Or will it elevate into a plasma matter state? So if we extend this concept of the twinity, we discussed the 2 points of the nanotech. But when we look at the 2 points of the picotech, they look like stars, don't they? So it's 2 points of the star tech. So we can understand the twinity of the nanotech and the twinity of the Gans tech. But what we have to understand is, how do we arrive from the shrinking of the nanotech to the picotech and the expansion of the Gans tech? Because if one is a counterweight of the other, where is the impetus? Where is the need to change that energy field strength? Because the field strength itself is balanced in a counterweight of magnetical gravitational force fields. Well, what causes the change to go from the picotech to the Gans-tech? So what is in that transaction zone which facilitates that? So now we understand that there's a polyatomic inertia gradient between the various field strengths. And between these field strengths, which each field strength has a transaction zone, is an interaction with another field strength. And that too facilitates a transaction zone. So if we were to take the transaction zone of the interaction of the cups of emotion, Gans, and the transaction zone of the cups of physicality, Gans, we would create an inertia gradient of another Gans of a Gans. But we could do that again, as in triple sec, and say, okay, if each time we do this, we are increasing the energy field by an order of magnitude, then we can see that each time we take a Gans of a Gans, it increases the field strength by order of magnitude. How many orders of magnitude? Well, it is hard to describe because it all is based on not only the field strength of the Ganses that are involved, but it also depends on the nearness and proximity to other fields, which act as part of the containment as well. So now we understand that each point, each gravitational inertia point is in itself a maggrav, and it is counterweighted by 2 points of view, that gravitational magnetical point of view and that magnetical gravitational point of view. So that's how things can change, and that's how things can move. So when we looked at the nanostate, and yes, it was a monatomic, but when you start to add the layers, you create these monatomic star formations. And before we advanced to the Gans, unbeknown to us, we created this picostate. And these picostates were within the interstitial network of the nanostate. So if we understand that nanostate is a superconductor at room temperature and has multiple monatomic energy flows, and if we understand that more than 3 in a chain is a polymer, then this is how we understand the difference between something that is physical in nature and, shall we say, gravitationally stable or inert, or something that is alive, is sentient. And if we understand the expansion of the fields, then we can understand what growth is. Because how does a baby become an adult? It's the expansion of the field. The soul of physicality has to expand because the physicality is an inertia density manifestation within the soul of physicality. So before the soul of the man can affect the soul of physicality, there has to be an input. And it's based on the environment to allow the soul of physicality to expand. And then the physicality can expand, and this is part of the growth. So this is how babies become children, and children become teenagers, and teenagers become adults. And this is all fundamentally part of the stability of duality. But that duality has a susceptibility with the changes in the input, the external intervention within that transaction zone. So the stability of the transaction zone is based on the magnetical gravitational relationship. But there are more magnetical points than there are gravitational points. and how many more is dependent on its need. And that need is to balance. So, if 3 points balance it, that's fine. But if it needs more, then, 12 points will balance it. And so where do you get these extra points? To become more dense. Well, it means that you have to have more orbitals. So the counterweight as a measure in its physical state, we say that the gravitational weight is how we determine the physical state. But when we look at the atomic state, we measure it by mass. But if we look at the nuclear state, which is the expansion, it's magnetical, and that is a measurement in Tesla units. And so our relationship with her in terms of our physicality, we measure speed with time. But that's in the physical state. In the plasma state, time has a different magnetical function. This is where the new science is headed, so that we understand these dynamic plasma relationships. Start with the horizontal transmission and the vertical transition, and then we get in the Earth-space point within this Earth-space field. And each one is a transaction zone, and this is how it is created. So when we look at the content that's inside the containment and inside the skin of the body is the Gans. But what do you see inside a stone? Well, you see more stone. And so that containment is the fence of that field. On Earth, we call that the Coulomb barrier. But in plasma science, it's a plasma barrier of that field. And so it's a field with a fence, but it's in a non-containment. It is susceptible to external intervention. So the creation of this plasma is based on the transaction zone affecting, in terms of life, the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, and it affects the creation of life. So we already talked about the growth, and that's one transaction zone. And then the growth in another transaction zone. So the growth of the solar physicality and the growth of the physicality, but in relationship to the environment. And so you get this structure within a structure, which is the duality, the brain function, and the physical function. And that becomes the gravitational transaction zone, which we are all near and dear to and familiar with. So our physicality is actually a captured field, and it has multiple layers. And we know that because of our aura, it has multiple emotions. And so these multiple emotions have multiple densities. So each density creates a different sphere. And we see that with the atomic orbitals. So the question is, how do you move from one orbital to the other orbital? Because they're all inertia density fields. So what causes that movement? In other words, when you're looking at the range of Ganses, you have the picogans in the core, and then you have the Gans popcorn at the extreme. And then you have all of these layers in between. How do you move? How do you move from and through this range? They're all Ganses. So you find that these Ganses are all interacting, and they all have a range based on the interaction. So the rotating Ganses, when you're looking down in the cup of life and you see the hole in the Gans, So on the left picture, the glass shield is the glass cup is a shield. But that is actually like the Coulomb barrier shield that the planet has. When you look at the cup on the right, we have the zinc Gans in the core and the copper Gans around. And there's a gap between the two Ganses. So the zinc in the core has a mag-rav relationship. The copper in the outside has a mag-rav relationship. The zinc in the core and the copper on the outside has a mag-rav relationship. So now this is a different Gans. You have a Gans of a Gans. And this is all part of the twinity of life. So you have this physical inertia field of connection. And this Coulomb barrier shield that we refer to is exclusively on this planet. But the shielding itself is the same in each and every energy field, because when you go through these orbitals, when you go from one orbital to another, you have to cross this barrier. So when you look at the sun shield, the shielding of sun also acts in the same manner as the Coulomb barrier on the Earth. So it's a barrier type shield. It protects the sun. And the sun gives what it wishes to, and it absorbs what it needs. And what it doesn't need, it shields. And so it's able to act as a catalyst. And fortunately for us, when we had an external visitor, the sun shielded us from that visitor. And that Coulomb barrier shield of the sun was non-physical, but the sun was in line as a barrier between 3i Atlas and the Earth, and that became a physical barrier. And so it worked the same way. And not only for 3i Atlas, but for R2 Swan, because the energy was so great that we needed assistance within that shield. So on our friendly atmosphere of the Earth, as we discussed in the 603rd Knowledge Seekers Workshop, there's a vertical alignment with respect to the fields, from the soul of physicality, to the physicality. And we saw the green path, how it created an infinity loop. But there was also an inertia field emission, and that allowed us to cross the inertia threshold into another energy state. This is how we transcend the Gans of the Ganses, because Gans can flow in water. So the water itself is a Gans, and it can exchange energy, and it can give and take. Gans has the same affinity. It gives and takes energy, but it can exchange that energy as a magnetical energy and as a gravitational energy. And that's what we have to understand. It's not just a charge, which is energy in motion, but it creates a mag-rav pathway. So there's a gravitational intensity, which we call the feedback attraction, and there's a magnetical outintensity, which we call the feeding repulsion. And so this is the difference between what we call an electron and what we call a neutron. And I'm sure you can all see the difference. And then in terms of when we bring all these Ganses together, then we have different reactors. And these are all part of the peace dome of stability, which gives us a shielding. That's a dimension point. And a star position, and that's a dimension point. And then the possession of whatever we have, that's a dimension point. And all these dimension points come in to play. And so when we look at the crop circles, we can start to look at these patterns and what they mean. So each circle, each field is a magnetical outintensity, and in the core is the gravitational intensity. And the tiniest of all the cores that we have been able to see is the picogans right at the center of the core, but it is laden with points. And so if we look at this particular picture with its outer circle with many points, we can start to understand the nature of the positive-negative relationship. So when we look at humanity in the same way, and we look at the fact that there are 7 civilizations, and each of these ones have had the same story, the same narrative of the Great Flood, and then we understand that we have all, through our Gans, manifest the same way. So that seed at the core of the picogans has manifested itself into the Gans of the Gans of the magnetical fields. So these fields are all the Gans of the Gans inertia. They're all fragments of the complexity. But the thing is, there are many variables on the matter, dark matter, and antimatter. So they're all fragments of the complexity. And so the Gans of the Gans matter is you have to choose the field strength of the matter and the dark matter individually and the antimatter as well. And these 3 fields come together. So when you look at the Gans of the Gans, you don't look at the Gans of the cup of emotion as a emotional transaction zone and the cup of the physicality as a physical transaction zone, but you look at the product of the interaction of the cup of emotion, Gans of the Gans, and the cup of physicality, Gans of the Gans. And now you have a transaction zone of the Gans of the Gans. And as we continue to grow, that field strength increases. And that's how we grow. And everything grows from the seed to the adult form. And so that is always a counterweight. So when we look at the carbon inertia highway, we see the carbon 12 and it's counterweighted by something that's working in the background. And that thing that's in the background is counterweighted by something else. And the 2 work together to create the multiple turning points with respect to our understanding of the fields of attention. So this has to be a unity, and that unity has to be within the community, that inner space unity. And so this translates at the binding zone, which is the bonding zone between the mental and the physical, or the bonding zone between the soul and the consciousness, or the bonding zone between the energy and the intention. And all of these are manifestations of the Gans. And they are all transacted on by an external energy force, which is the principal matter, which comes from the PM text, which they themselves are magnetical, but they themselves are a magrav as an energy pack, and they come together in this dilution of these force fields, which dilute into the combination of the plasmagen conversion of the various points on the antimatter, dark matter, and the mattergen, and how they converge together. But in order to manifest in the physicality, there has to be a field interaction with a place. And that place, by our choice, is Earth space. And Earth space has that gravitational stability, which is a magrav. And that Earth space has an interaction with our stability as a human. And that interaction is an inertia density manifestation. So the plasma and plasma come together and they create this dimension point, which is magnetical and gravitational. And that dimension point is the transaction zone. And this is how we have gravitational conformation. Life on this planet is oxygen dependent, and that oxygen is transparent, but it emits a light. And we know that because it actually can give us an emission spectrum, and it has to cross the threshold. So oxygen is a non-visible gas, but it gives us a fingerprint so we can have gravitational tracking. So within that tracking sphere, these are different matter plasma dimensions. One you can touch and see, that's the physical gravitational state, and one you cannot touch or see, that's the magnetical feeding state. But both are part of the matter plasma dimension, and the matter plasma is the feedback dimension. And so that's what we dominate with, our feedback. And we don't see what is created from the substructure, the other Ganses, and the Ganses of the Ganses, and the triple sec of the Ganses. So this is the plasma matter dilemma that we have. We can see the atomic state through the various layers. We can see the nanostate, special equipment, we can see the picostate, and the Gans state is fortunately big enough that we can see. But each of these are a product of the transaction zone between the substructure of the plasma state. And then we have various interactions, and each of these become a magRav energy transfer state. So this is why we are having a little trouble on this planet, because we need supplementation due to consumption, unlike the sun, which is a catalyst. But we are basing our supplementation on acquired knowledge, which is a conditional teaching by the ancient teachers. What we're missing is the unconditional teaching by the Creator. We don't have to take a 20% cut. We're now with a new awareness where we can have a historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and the loosh harvesting, right? That's the threshold we have to cross, because humanity's cross as a burden is not understanding the relationship between the soul and the soul of physicality, and the vertical transition, or the soul of physicality and physicality, which is the horizontal transmission. We are crossing that threshold of understanding. And we're doing it very rapidly as we're going into that uncharted territory, because we're all with the herd at that turning point where many stars are beyond the nanomonatomic state that we can see in that range from decay to radiation. And we are part of the AI, the ancestral intelligence, when we are the technology, we are the inertia product, and we are the image of our dimensional convergence point. So we can affect that change. We can be part of that change. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just to understand energy portability, where the energy state transition in elevation is going from physical matter state to energy state. In inertia, it's the opposite, going from energy state to physical matter state. So when we talk about elevation, that involves expansion. And so when we're talking about the Gans of the Gans, that involves another expansion at a different order of magnitude. And then we talk about the Gans of the Gans of the Gans, that's a triple sec, 1,000 orders of magnitude, or 3 orders of magnitude, 1,000 times the field strength. So when we look at the dynamic soul initiator, it all depends on what field strength you're operating on. So the soul of the Creator obviously is bigger than the soul of the earth. And the soul of the family of humanity, which is on earth, is a representation of the soul of the man. But the soul of the man has the soul of the body, and then we have the soul of the cells. And no translation is needed. There's a direct communication, and this is all part of the tuning into the cosmic rays, which is actually feeding us the soul food that we need. All we need to do is to plug into the Creator so that we can turn on to that energy and drop out of our resistance, so that we can receive that key inertia point that is the energy that we need. So we have to provide that pattern so that we can get that energy. And so for seeking this greater oneness, 617 weeks in a row, the Knowledge Seekers workshops have been suddenly transcending the limitations of nuclear science and understanding the expansion of the plasma science and how it affects us. Because now we are in the practical application of being able to turn the diamonds of nanotech to gold, which is of the plasma tech. And we are beyond May 10th, 2025 to display to the public the Gans affinity of truth. So we are looking for practical technology release because it's hard to sleep when our beds are burning. It seems like we need a scientific rescue and a financial rescue and a political rescue. It's all part of the preservation. And here we are as its consumers not understanding the creation. So we need a creation rescue because there's a physical affinity that we have to understand. This Gans ball, which is emotionally charged, is part of the trinity of the picotech. And that comes to the confrontation with the anomaly to understand the difference between the CO2 gas, which is life-giving, and the CO2 gas, which is suffocating. It's suffocating to our breathing, but it is the food of life for the vertical people. So, through the One Nation Network, we're opening the blinds, One Nation Network at a time. And that time is now. We have activated that whole principle because our mission is to bring peace on earth and joy in humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equal to everyone, that no one is left out, no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. So help us achieve this goal. It's just a very simple thing to do. This is the Keshe Foundation, Spaceship Institute, Teachings on Plasma Science. So we're welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. Choose it, sign it unconditionally, and mean it sincerely. It's hard to fake sincerity, isn't it? The point of the true Gans tech is to cross the polyatomic boundaries. The wars on Earth space do not translate across the peace dome. So is that inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? Well, it's time to learn the history of self in a universal context, because the Gans is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions. The Gans has a split personality, depending on the field strength of matter, plasma, and universal states. So the plasma science needs to continue to be delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcoming all to the new golden outer space age. Not only is this the end of the lesson, but it is also the end of the intermediate Gans Tech series. So I hope you enjoyed the ride. Thank you so much for participating.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for presenting your understanding of this knowledge. And I'm sure you're going to sell a magic box next, right? So that we can understand this. Very good, very good. Let's see if our participants have any questions for you or something they'd like clarified. I didn't realize we had loose leaking as well as loose harvesting. Is all of that loose leaking kind of negative, or is is there any positive aspects of loose leaking, like elevation of another person? Would that be loose leaking, or is all looshes taken by theft or something? That was what I was thinking.
Well, life is hard enough, there are lots who are in the business of stealing. They like your honey and they want to steal it. So it's hard enough. You don't have to facilitate or enhance that by being a leaker. So it's like a boat. It's hard enough to navigate a boat through rough waters. You don't have to make it harder by puncturing a hole in the hull. Yeah, loose leaking is a common problem, and it emanates from a depression. And one of those things that is enhancing depression right now is this increased awareness, because as we become aware of the reality that, we're all hamsters in a cage, and some have bigger cages than others. We still realize that we're within a cage. And it doesn't matter how much money you have, it's a depressing notion to know that you're not a free man. And so if you don't have a solution, then you're focusing on the problem. And a problem needs a solution. And a problem gets solved by that solution. So what we're doing at the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute is focusing on the solutions. That's what this is all about. Back to you, sir.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Does anyone have a question they'd like to pose? And apparently, the AI can do quite a bit of loose harvesting. According to Mr. Kesh had mentioned the AI a number of times, and as he said, we see a lot of ways the AI is used, and we see a lot of ways the AI is misused. And apparently he went through that example about allowing certain Israel, I think, use the AI to plan its war, but it made a lot of mistakes. So, and then he talked about the financial system. Could the AI actually sort of bend out of shape even our financial system? Again, it seems that it's programmed by us. So it probably has, I mean, humanity, and it probably has the same shortcomings as humanity does, I would think, depending again on the algorithm. But it does seem like it's, I know I even read a headline recently where the United States was thinking of turning over its nuclear strikes or capabilities to the AI to make the decision on when it should be used or how it should be used and the rest. So this could be very dangerous territory. But maybe, as we know, with the One Nation Network being put into the ocean and many of these systems pulling ocean water for cooling, perhaps we'll see a bit of a tempered emotion in a way within the AI.
Well, let's remember that humanity can be abused, and on that basis, AI can be abused as well.
Okay, anyone else want to ask a question? And I was always, when he's mentioned this chess game and so on, I was always, and I know I've mentioned this before in this meeting, about playing sports activities or competition as a win-win. Of course, Mr. Kesh has mentioned this as well. And perhaps this chess game could even, I don't know if we'll need to do that, but imagine having you take the board of the chess game, which is impregnated or pointed with all sorts of Ganses and their interaction. Imagine if you created a soccer field in the same manner, or a basketball court, for example. Or what about a hockey rink, Alex? Could the players then, instead of getting dejected by losing, just enjoy, and the fans as well, just enjoy the beauty of the game, just observing the beauty, whether it's basketball, football, baseball? This would be, again, would we need it? It was just a concept by expanding the chessboard in a way. And
Yeah, that's a very good question.
British Isles, there's a lot of people that get into huge brawls in these soccer events. I'm sure the alcohol helps a bit, but you get those whiskey muscles, as they say. But perhaps creating stadiums like this, there wouldn't be any of this fighting afterwards. Both would enjoy the beauty of the game and just observing, rather than take it through the physicality and assault others because your team didn't win.
Well, to those who've played soccer, they'll know what I'm talking about, because you've reminded me of a personal situation. As I grew older, I like to play soccer as a physical activity. I enjoyed the sport, and I enjoyed the artistry that was associated with it. So we were playing every Sunday morning, and we were getting together, and all you have to do is show up. Someone brings a soccer ball, and you just show up and you can play. So you just split the teams up and play. And every once in a while, you start to forget that you're there for the physical fitness and for the fun, the camaraderie, the social atmosphere, and you start to get a little competitive.
Mhm.
And it never fails, especially when you start to keep score. And one of the reasons that I enjoyed playing in higher leagues, even though I was amateur, and I didn't like playing in the lower leagues, is because the skill set of the in the lower leagues was poorer, of course, and so were the shall we say, understanding of the sport. And and the problem for me was that when I played in the lower level leagues, I got kicked all the time. And nobody likes getting kicked.
Instead of kicking the ball, you got a knee in the groin or something. These guys.
Yeah, because they're uncoordinated, okay? So they can control their legs, okay? So they would seem that, well, if I'm in a kicking motion and you end up in the way, well, it's too bad for you. But in the higher leagues, a more skillful player knows the difference between you and the ball. And so if they're going to accidentally kick with you, they do retract that or diminish the impact. And I played in a higher amateur league, not bragging or anything. I'm just saying I hardly had any injuries. And yet when I went into the lower leagues, I came out with bruises galore, and I hated it. So here we were on the Sunday morning, and this guy from this industrial league was kicking me. And he didn't know that he was kicking me. He didn't even apologize. He said, "Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kick you," or, I'm sorry I slipped," or, he just kicked you like a vicious mule. And, I thought, well, I teach him a lesson. And I got him in position, and I stepped on his foot. And all I needed to do was just shift my weight a little bit, and I would have broken his ankle. And I thought, this is kind of stupid. This man is amateur. He's just coming out for the same reason that I am, for just enjoying it, and just because he doesn't have the skill set, he just can't control himself. He just thinks kicking other people is just part of the game, is a normal thing. And I could have hurt him, and how would he go to work in the morning? And then how would I feel having hurt him? And it's like, what is the purpose of my coming out for my enjoyment? Would that be my successful enjoyment? I came and I broke the leg of another player in a friendly game. That's so stupid. And I just had to step back, and I released his foot, and I walked back, and I went behind the net, and I counted to 20 to calm down and just give my head a shake. I said, like, what is the purpose of what I'm doing? And the love of the game kind of faded in the background. So if I really did love the game, then I had to honor that game. And I wasn't there to injure anybody, and I wasn't there to abuse anybody. And, this instinct of fighting, like you say, fighting in the stands, this tribal warfare. And I like your comment with respect to um, liquid muscles. What did you call it?
Whiskey muscles.
Oh, whiskey muscles. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. I'd like to use that in the future. But the point is that if we were to incorporate the plasma science in these games, I have to wonder, would they be as popular? There was a visiting team that came in from Denmark, And they had thousands of people playing soccer of all levels. And they couldn't understand the attraction of being a spectator because they didn't have spectators. Everybody was a participant, you know. To them, the wonder of playing the game and experiencing the exhilaration of scoring a goal and just being able to demonstrate skill, it was wonderful. And you worked on your own skill set, and everybody played. There were no fans, there were no spectators. Everybody was playing somewhere. Everybody was too busy playing to be a spectator. So you wonder what would happen to the notion of spectators watching a sporting event, because let's face it, with those high price salaries, I was looking at the statistics today. The cheapest ticket at one game was $1,271. That was the cheapest ticket available. In other words, the place was sold out. So if I wanted to watch it in person, that's how much it would cost. That's
Again, maybe the crowd will cheer for both sides. Again, enjoying the beauty of the plays and the way the human form can do some of these things instead of this win lose. As you say, one has to win, the other has to lose. This is the way business is done, and stocks are traded, and the whole kind of environment on this planet. But maybe we can move into this win-win situation. I know China attempted that in the BRICS, but apparently they've gotten off the track with that some way.
well, they won't go too far off the track because, there are always consequences. So something is always something. So when you start to, shall we say, fall off the track, you have to come to grips with those consequences. And like I say, I looked at the consequences of what I was doing, and fortunately, I became aware of those consequences, and I pulled back. The gentleman that I was going to, physically abuse was totally unaware of my intentions, and he just that's his nature. He was just unaware. And if I were to come up and explain to him that, he would just wonder what I'm talking about, because for him, having a physical accident in the game is all part of the game. Well, yeah, it is, but when you basically are out there kicking someone and claiming that you are, not doing it intentionally in the professional ranks, if you get hurt, the other guy had full intention to hurt you because otherwise, so you have to have, clear skill to be able to protect yourself. And on that basis, I was coaching a lot of uh, teenage teams, and we never had a broken leg or a broken arm. The worst case, did have a broken toe, and where the other player literally jammed my player's toe. But other than that, we didn't have like really, really serious injuries, because not only did I teach the players, and that was my style, not to hurt the other players, but more importantly, not to get hurt and how not to get hurt. And I tell you what, we played some games against some physical teams, and they couldn't match us in terms of skill, so they relied on the physicality, and we had to protect ourselves because they were not holding back in their physicality. So you have to wonder what it is that you're trying to promote. And, they always say, oh, well, sportsmanship. Yeah. But sportsmanship's out the window when it comes to, did you win the cup? At that point, no holds barred, do whatever it takes to win. Well, again, there are always consequences. So you can pick your poison or you can pick your glory. Back to you, Mark.
Right, and I think that's the way the research centers will go. Mr. Kesh said the researchers will leave their national flag outside the door of the research centers. It'll be a win-win, or as he put it one time, peace will be the winner. And perhaps we can promote that in the sporting world as well. Not to make a difference whether you win or lose, but just that you put on a beautiful performance for the crowd with the different plays and so on and so forth. So I think they'll be cheering and I think they'll be there. But it'll
Well,
be
just remember that, they have supplanted a lot of the glory in the professional sports for money. And so, that just becomes an extension of the society where the conduct is always justified. The trading off the compassion for humanity for money. And so it becomes a microcosm of our life and our society. And so if the change is to be implemented in our society, then I think you're right. We have to, look at the change also in our sporting ventures. So, there are many shows on TV where they introduce competition as well, such as the game of love. I mean, what kind of game is that, And how does that turn into a competition? And, all sorts of ugliness can evolve out of there. But uh, when we understand that earth is heaven, and how we approach it is how we manifest. So if we want to manifest heaven, then we have to be mindful of our conduct. So I want to thank everybody for allowing me to continue to present, and I hope you enjoyed these sessions. And we'll be starting a new series next week, and we'll see where this path leads us. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for this continued endeavor, and stay tuned. These are exciting times.
okay. Anyone else wants to raise a question or a point before we end the session? Again, I don't think we need to go 5 hours or anything like that. Once we have the One Nation network set up, I think we'll be on there quite frequently for meetings or just for interactions. This will be where the sort of plasma cafe will be located, and people can come and share with people with a similar scientific understanding, a similar ethos, and a similar language. So this will be a beautiful place to sort of park yourself on a weeknight or a weekday or a weekend or whatever you'd like to do. More and more of this, and of course, this is going to be extended to the governments where we start to see them, as Mr. Ketch said, as we start pulsing these peace fields 24 hours a day, we'll start to see things in the news. Again, India and Pakistan, other hot spots around the planet. Suddenly we see world leaders embracing one another and peace and the rest of these things. So I think we'll see the results slowly at first, perhaps, but it will build up as more and more of these units go out and start to do their work. Anyone else? Okay, as I said earlier, you're invited to join the Universal Council on the energy level. We're trying to raise the awareness, the collective awareness of all of us that we bring the change by giving. And I think even if you participate in this for a second or a minute, you can feel proud about the work you do. And you'll feel proud about the person you are, and you'll feel proud about the difference you make. And then, of course, we bring up the ethos of Mitra, or the gift of the three wise men that all the Christians missed. And if you can sort of put these together, you definitely will create that shielding around yourself, the thinking, the speaking, and the acting. Again, easier said than done, but let's try and move in that direction. And as he said, you can create that repulsive shield around you as the three I has, very similar. And of course, this idea of the three wise men and the gifts that they're given, if you understand it, it's not only the cornerstone on this planet, but it'll be the cornerstone of life in the universe. So it's probably a good idea to start approaching this and see how it fits you or pleases you to use these sort of gifts. Anyone else have anything else they'd like to share? Otherwise, I'll play the final disclaimer. Meeting will come to an end. I'm going to take the screen. Sorry, I didn't show that. I forgot to take the screen at that point. But again, what we just showed were the gifts of the three wise men and a little saying that is very powerful about being proud of the work you do. This is one of the things we're always self-serving, and we don't seem to get the satisfaction that we think we should get. But by serving the others, as he said, is this the key? The elevation of the soul to serve become the key, not a throne in the physical life. But we all, including myself, seem to go that way. And of course, realizing that the wealth is within us and not belonging to us. But it's for you to apply that. Again, it's up to you to investigate and understand this knowledge for yourself and apply it and trigger some of the systems. But I think the One Nation Network will help trigger some of the systems within you as it basically transfers that knowledge as you're using the system to the point where you may not even need the system in the future. But this will be our kind of occupation in the future, is the transmutation of fields. And as you said, a very beautiful place, Alex, but still an extremely harsh place to exist. But we're going to bring a balance to that as well. Maybe that's the counterweight, right? I know you've mentioned counterweight or bringing a balance in, and perhaps this is the time for beautiful place, and let's counterbalance that with an easier place to live. And I think Mr. Kesh has this well thought out with the Kesh coins and the rest of the structure with the cosmic ray and the shares of Mark Ray. So you can all get in early and keep expanding this network. This is how I think the change is about to come. Again, this is 50 years of Mr. Kesh's development of the technology, and I don't even think we know half of the developments that are going on in the back of the Kesh Foundation, probably less than 5%, as Mr. Kesh said. But thank you all for supporting. Continue to support. As he said, we need a lot of support. And as Alex also said, we have to understand more as well. But, you know, when you mentioned that cup of life 1 and 2, and you said, Alex, one was for the emotions and one was for the physicality, don't we see that same twinity system in the One Nation Network, where the network is for in a way, the physicality, the knowledge, and the rest, where the antenna or the energy dimension is for our emotional balance in the rest, or understanding that. Please go ahead, unless that hand was up inadvertently.